Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Charlotte Chedeville. I'm the Senior Project and Program Manager at CIPD in the Middle East, and I'm delighted to be your host today. Recently, the CIPD issued a report on managing multicultural teams, which looked at the dynamics and the challenges and opportunities of managing across cultures, focusing on groups across Ireland, the UK, but also the Middle East and Asia. In some regions, it seems that we all do it and we do it naturally, but does it mean that we get it right? What are the opportunities of having diverse teams and how can we get better at it and take the opportunity that we have in the context of today to reinvent the ways in which we work? These are some of the questions that we'll be asking my panel today. I'm delighted to be joined by Barry Lumpkins, who's a VP Leadership and Talent Development at DP World based in Dubai in the UAE, just like me. Jake Young, our research associate at CIPD, who led on this specific piece of research joining us from London, as well as Asif Sadiq, Senior Vice President and Head of Equity and Inclusion International at Warner Media. I will let each of them introduce themselves in more details. So thank you everybody for joining us. Asif, would you care to give a few words on how you relate to this topic?
Definitely, thank you, and hi everyone. As mentioned, I currently head up equity and inclusion for Warner Media International, but also have worked in the global space over a number of years at EY, at Adidas, and so on. And I think that's why, for me, this is such an important topic. Just understanding the importance of working in a global environment, in multicultural teams. The impact of that and how to create true inclusion within that environment to really succeed and create a sense of belonging for each and every individual.
The difference between diversity and inclusion is one that we'll explore very shortly. Thank you, Asif. Jake, a few words about this, about yourself. I know you'll be the first one to start anyways.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Charlotte. So I'm Jake Young. I'm in the research team at CIPD. I've worked on several projects over the last couple of years on inclusion and diversity. Things like we did a really important project looking at what works in diversity management a couple of years ago with colleagues in the research team. But yeah, as mainly for this webinar. As Charlotte said, I wrote the report on managing multicultural teams, which combined important literature with focus groups with managers of multicultural teams, and came up with some really interesting and important findings. So in a few minutes, I'll be going over those in a bit more detail.
Great, thank you, Jake. And finally, my colleague Barry. Hi, Barry.
Great. Hi, Charlotte. Listen, it's great to be here with yourself, Jake and Asif. So my name is Barry Lumpkins. I am currently, I'm the Global Head of Learning, Leadership, and Talent at DP World, the world's largest port operator. As I was just kind of reflecting a little bit leading into this webinar, I actually have a lot of connection points with this topic. I mean, I'm myself a dual national. I've been a part of teams that stretch across the globe, but I've also managed teams across a number of different countries. And I've been lucky enough, although I'm dying to travel, like I think many of you, but pre-COVID, I managed largely due to business travel. I visited 48 countries. I actually counted them yesterday. I hadn't done that before. So this is something I'm really passionate about and really looking forward to dive deeper.
Amazing. Thank you, Barry. 48 countries sound just great right now. All right, before we get started, I wanted to give you a few housekeeping remarks. So for those of you joining us, if you can't hear, please try to log out and log in again. It might just be that, or check that your sound is coming from your system. This session is being recorded and it will be available on demand via the webinar section of the CIPD website, and of course, spread on all of our social media channels. To submit questions to us today, I'm sure many of you know Zoom very well, but you can do so through the Q&A button down below, or use the chat box and tell us where you're joining us from and what you relate to and disagree or agree with, and network with others. In terms of the specific topic today, we're updating the FAQs and resources on our website all the time. Shall I say websites, as we also have Ireland, the UK website and Middle East website today, as new information becomes available. CIPD members can get individual legal advice in the UK. You can call our HR Inform helpline. It's available 24/7. And finally, remember that if you're a member joining us from the UK or Ireland, you can also access our new Wellbeing Hub and helpline. Together with new award winner wellbeing provider Health Assured, we're now providing CIPD members with free help and support 24/7 and 365 days a year. All right, that was my plug. Now let's dive into today's topic. And to get started, I'd like to invite you, Jake, to tell us a little bit more about the findings of this report. What kind of struck out to you the most? And what did we learn about multicultural teams from this research?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Charlotte. And welcome everybody to the webinar. Hopefully people joining from all over the place. So yeah, as I said, I'll be giving a brief overview of this report, which looked closely at the challenges and opportunities for managers of multicultural teams. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So to give a bit of context on why this research comes at such an important and relevant time, we should first say that multicultural teams have seen long-term growth as a result of things like globalization, greater workforce diversity and migration. And so the prevalence of teams working globally has been steadily growing for a number of years. But with the COVID-19 pandemic over the last year and a half, organizations have been forced to massively change their ways of working. And so as we look ahead to home working, which looks set to continue in the future, multicultural teams are only likely to become more and more common. And so what's likely to happen is that the spotlight on managers of these teams who face key challenges in helping not only the teams, but their organizations to really thrive is likely to become brighter. And so as we look to see a way out of the pandemic, it's really important that organizations know how to manage these teams really effectively. So moving on to the next slide, we wanted to take an evidence-based approach to this research, as we do with a lot of our research. So what this means is engaging with the best available evidence in order to make the most effective decisions and lead to the most positive outcomes. So this means relying less on things like personal experiences, on things like anecdotes, sources that on their own may not be trustworthy. And so instead, evidence-based HR looked specifically at 4 sources. So these are scientific literature, professional expertise, stakeholder concerns, and internal people data. And on to the next slide. So we looked particularly at 2 of these, so scientific literature and practitioner expertise. So this was a kind of 2 approaches to the research. The first, which was a thematic review of literature on multicultural teams, so looking at how they're defined, their benefits and their challenges. And then we conducted online focus groups with managers from 3 different global regions. So we had a group in the UK, a group in the Middle East, and a group in Asia Pacific. And we used these focus groups to identify their challenges and really highlight the skills that they feel are important to work effectively in a culturally diverse environment. And just a little bit more on evidence-based practice, if we move on, yeah, thank you. It's a really clear process, as you can see from the graphic, and it just helps us ask really practical questions and come to effective decisions. So if we go to the next slide, in terms of this, this report then, what we wanted to focus on was firstly defining multicultural teams, but then exploring the unique benefits and challenges that they can face. And then we also looked at the idea of cultural intelligence in leaders, which can be really important. And then finally, for a kind of COVID COVID perspective on things, we looked at how the pandemic's affected these teams in really unique ways. And so on to the next slide, we looked at what multicultural teams actually are. So really important to define this and kind of get a clear sense of how we understand this. So research evidence and manager insights frame multicultural teams as those whose members share a variety of values and attitudes, not only as a result of demographics, but as a result also of their experiences. So evidence suggests that cultural diversity can affect teams in 3 different ways. So first, people may be attracted to those who they find similar to themselves in terms of values and beliefs. Second, people can categorize themselves into groups and categorize others as outsiders and are likely to be more favorable to those who are inside their group. And then finally, a more kind of positive take on cultural diversity that we focus on a bit more closely is the idea that cultural diversity is an opportunity rather than a barrier, and something that can bring much more varied contributions to teams and unique perspectives. So in our focus groups, Middle East and Asia Pacific respondents were particularly aware of multiculturalism in their teams, where culturally diverse staff are the norm, and it's something that's encouraged in those regions more so than the UK. And managers also highlighted sensitivity and empathy as really key things to creating trust and supportive environments for culturally diverse staff. So if we move on, so we identified 2 key areas in which there are challenges to overcome and opportunities to really grab hold of if managers are able to unlock the potential of their culturally diverse teams. So the first is creativity. So moving to the next slide. Culturally diverse teams are more creative, so especially those with diversity. So that's not simply things like different ethnicities and nationalities, but diversity of attitudes and values towards culture. And what we found that was these teams benefit both in a professional sense and a personal sense. So thinking professionally, teams with cultural diversity are able to view themselves, their products, and their customers from loads of different different viewpoints. So this allows them to produce really unique and creative services for a variety of stakeholders. And then on a more personal level, simply learning more about each other as people. So our managers highlighted things like traditions, things like food and humor, for example. These really encourage staff to draw on the unique perspectives of their colleagues in order to do things like innovate and approach problem solving in different ways. So if we move on again, please. So the biggest challenge that comes to these teams is in the form of language barriers, which present a real challenge to effective communication. So they can reduce people's levels of trust in each other and their expectations of successful work. They can cause anxiety to those who aren't especially proficient in the shared language, and they do sometimes lead to what's called code switching, where people switch to their native language away from the shared language. So what's really important is sensitive managers who firstly raise awareness of these barriers, and then do things like highlighting the achievements of staff beyond their language proficiency. And then also doing things like listening attentively for cultural nuances of communication. And all of these things combined help create an environment in which staff can communicate openly and without fear of judgment. So what kind of became, what was kind of notable from our discussions with managers was that creating an environment in which diversity and different unique contributions are valued can be more important than one that has perfect communicators. So if we look on the next slide, thank you. So thinking about cultural intelligence. So this is kind of about the ability to successfully interact among diverse cultures. And it's something that can be developed through things like perspective taking, so walking in somebody else's shoes, trying to kind of empathize with their circumstances, and suspending judgments about others. And it's been linked to things like enhanced performance, greater job satisfaction, and knowledge sharing among staff. And so managers really need to show cultural intelligence, and they can do this by being aware of and sensitive to cultural diversity, and suspending judgment about others until they have enough information about them. So one recommendation is to consider a flexible approach to managing different people from different cultures, and kind of taking a real genuine interest in them and their experiences, and changing the kind of management approach depending on the different circumstances of staff. So on to the next slide. The final thing that we focused on then is thinking about the pandemic and the rapid increase in home working, as I mentioned earlier. So we found that multicultural virtual teams have faced some challenges similar to face-to-face teams, but also some that are unique. So firstly, geographically dispersed multicultural teams also see a boost in creativity in kind of similar ways to static teams. So where there are kind of unique and varied perspectives being considered. However, one unique challenge they face is maintaining a healthy work-life balance and communicating effectively while working in different time zones. So managers here are really important to be aware of the best time intervals for team members to meet, not only to ensure effective collaboration and teamwork, but to reduce the likelihood of employees working outside their usual hours. And we also found that something really important, and kind of everyone's been talking about it, but simply bringing the team together for things like catch-ups, meetings, hangouts, those kind of things, really brings the team together, keeps everybody involved and engaged. And then if we go to the next slide, please. So in terms of key takeaways then, we kind of have three main areas here. So there's overcoming language barriers, showing cultural intelligence, and making the most of virtual working. So in terms of overcoming language barriers then, as I mentioned earlier, raising awareness of these language barriers in team meetings to ensure that everybody understands instructions and tasks and doesn't feel hesitant to contribute is really important. Also speaking to people who do code switch or change into their native language to kind of understand why they do this and what can be done to promote more effective open communication across language barriers, rather than expecting flawless communication, can be really important. As I said, highlighting the achievements of staff beyond their language proficiency can kind of help their colleagues recognize what they do besides that. And then if we look at showing cultural intelligence, so managers should show sensitivity not only to employees' demographic differences, but to their values and their experiences and their attitudes. Managers should also encourage employees to seek these attitudes out and use the different perspectives of others, not only to enhance team decision making, things like that, but to learn more about each other, become more rounded, kind of get to know each other on a more personal and professional level. And then finally, in terms of virtual working, encouraging the use of things like video calling or what's called rich media, where possible, would be really useful. So because this allows staff to share feedback and resolve differences quickly. Also thinking about the best time intervals for team members to meet. Getting to know the communication preferences of your staff can be really important. So some may feel more comfortable communicating in certain ways, such as over email, and being flexible to their desires will help boost their confidence in communicating. And then finally, as I mentioned, regularly bringing the team together, being creative with this. So as well as work meetings and project updates, things like that, creating kind of team games, social sessions, sort of tasks that people can do together, just provides that opportunity to touch base and allows the team to provide support for each other as well. Okay, so on to the penultimate slide, I think it is. Just a few resources here. If anybody wants to look more closely at this, you've got the link to the full report here. That was, well, I tried to be quite brief. I'm not sure how brief I was, but there's a lot more information in there. We've got a culture and culture change fact sheet. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there's a report that we looked in which we looked at diversity management that works. So just a few more resources there to look at if anybody's interested. And yeah, I think that's all from me. So thank you for letting me quickly give that overview. Sorry if I was a long time, I couldn't quite tell, but I tried to get through quite quickly.
No, it's perfect. Thank you so much, Jake, for taking us through the findings of this report. Great start for a discussion. So there's quite a bit to unpack, and we'll try to bring as much context and practice as we can. And for those who want the resources, we'll link them back at the end and in the chat. So my first question to you, Asif and Barry. What exactly do we mean by managing multicultural teams? How does it impact your work as an HR, as managing diverse teams? And perhaps I'm interested in hearing the similarities or differences between the Middle East, Europe, the different versions that you've worked in terms of the makeup of your team, but also trends that you've noticed. Asif, over to you first, perhaps, yeah?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Jake, for the presentation as well, which was very informative. I think the first thing to acknowledge, yes, there's differences in the different sort of continents and countries and so on. But I think one of the difficulties that arises in this space is where we assume that the right way is the dominant culture's way or the dominant market's way. And what I mean by that is if a company is headquartered or in a dominant country or environment, so let's say the UK or New York and so on, then the view is that, yes, we're very multicultural, but the culture in the UK is the best, right? And that's the one you have to adhere to. I think that piece needs to be addressed. So when we're looking and thinking about multicultural teams, even if you're based in your head office, doesn't mean that that culture is the dominant culture. So you have to reflect on the different markets and the different cultures. And it's about that sort of meeting in the middle rather than, okay, we value multiculturalism, but actually what you're going to do is you're going to join our meetings and behave the way we do and come or fit into the cultural norms that we're used to. That doesn't mean it's a multicultural environment. It just means that you are replicating your culture into other countries and assuming that they will sign on. And I think those are really, really important areas, and also understanding what different things mean to different people. And Jake touched on this, but what's right in one location and what's right in one way of thinking or doing things in a certain way isn't necessarily the same in another market. And that's important to acknowledge. And the final bit, and then I'll pass it over to Barry, is the piece around language. And language comes out quite a lot. I must highlight this because the amount of times I've heard this over my 20 odd years of doing this is unbelievable. But English is a language. It is not a test of intelligence. It is nothing beyond a language. The problem is we classify how well we're working in a multicultural team or an international team based on, oh, that person's really good. Why they're good? Oh, the English is good. Or that person's not good because the English is not good. It's a language. So, and I think we need to get over that barrier, because what that does is it actually automatically creates a insider-outsider group. And also this sort of throwing big words into, I mean, I see PowerPoints coming out from main markets, and I'm like, why? Like, it's a simple thing. Why not just call it diversity? Why the 3 paragraphs talking about everything but diversity to describe diversity? Because when you start translating that into other languages or trying to explain it, we're overcomplicating something. So those are some of the key points I think are really important. But the language piece is one of my personal frustrations.
That's really interesting, and I'd be interested to hear your view, Barry, because in the Middle East, in Dubai, English is almost nobody's language, and yet it's a language in which we work. I'm French. Barry, I think you're half Swedish, half American.
Yeah, well, I'm a dual national, Swedish and American. Yeah. interesting combination.
So what does track out to you, and what would you like to say in comparison to Asif's point? We'll pick up on the language shortly because I think that's an interesting one.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, one, I couldn't agree with Asif more on everything he said. And you know, I've been lucky enough to work for some great global organizations, and to Asif's point, where those organizations grew up, even though they have a footprint all over the globe, the sort of the headquarter, the national culture, where they grew up in my case, Denmark, Germany, it really sort of permeates through the company. It's kind of that national culture really drives kind of the way people do things. So that's one. On the language piece, I just wanted to say one thing. It just struck me, you know, I had an experience many years ago in a company where this was probably 10 years ago, where every Friday morning there was this kind of departmental breakfast, and a few of us in the department didn't speak the local language. In this case, it was Danish. For some reason, the head of the function insisted on speaking Danish for those breakfasts, which kind of was a sort of push some of us out that didn't speak Danish. And that has kind of stuck with me, and it just reminded me of that, this whole thing around in crowd, out crowd, and the power of, you know, excluding people because of language.
Yeah, the thing that keeps coming up is the idea of inclusion, exclusion, and a lot of what we talked about when we talked about managing multicultural teams and the findings that Jake showed are not exactly just specific to cultural diversity, are they? A lot could be true of the different races, of religions, of neurodiversity, of gender diversity. I know both of you have a vested interest in diversity and inclusion. Asif, do you manage cultural diversity in a different way than you manage other types of diversity? Or do you think it should be?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to, I mean, the cultural diversity piece intersects with different elements of diversity. And I think the challenge is that we have a tendency to group people into boxes, because we're good at boxes, right? So you choose a box based on your visible diversity, and then it's assigned to you for the rest of your life with your needs and what your development needs are and how we're going to progress you and so on. The truth is, intersectionality means there's more layers to one person, right? Firstly. But secondly, a person's interpretation of some of their diversity elements, whether it be gender, sexual orientation, religion, disability, is intertwined into culture. So unless you get the cultural element of that, you are making assumptions on someone's needs based on, you know, whatever Wikipedia says, or, you know, any other platform. So we need to get beyond sort of traditional matrix and actually start exploring what the intersect is, and what does that unique identity mean? I mean, in the Middle East, it's interesting. One of the things that always comes up is, for example, Ramadan, or, you know, the month of fasting and so on. Globally, companies tend to do this sort of, and I've worked for numerous companies who've done this. They send out this sort of, you know, flyer to line managers and so on, say, hey, all your staff, you know, will be fasting. Your Muslim staff will be fasting, and here's 10 things you can do for them. And I'm like, how do those 10 things globally relate to every single person? What we should be saying is, actually, there might, and I say might because not every Muslim fasts, and that's fine. But there might be some people this month coming up, explore, have conversations, be human, speak to people, rather than, hey, here's a 10-point checklist that you sit there with your staff and tick off, because it's not the same. Some people might want to leave early. Some people might want to start later. Some people might want flexibility. Some people might not want anything. They might just want to get on with it without you interfering in their business. So, but it's that unique cultural perspective around their religion that might be important to them. So it's really important that we go beyond traditional matrix.
I agree. It's what you were talking about, going beyond these assumptions and not necessarily trying to put people into boxes or tell them what to think. I want to pick back up on the question of culture, organizational culture, which is the first thing that you two brought. Not necessarily assuming that the culture of the company has to do with wherever you are, or that it is the culture of the dominant country, neither that it is the right one to follow. Bridget is asking us, how, in your experience, and I'll ask this to you, Barry, in your experience, how do you ensure that the culture, the organization culture that you create isn't necessarily that of the dominant country, and that you make space and room for your own organizational identity, but also for those nuances for your leaders to adapt, whether you're working across Africa or Europe or Middle East?
Well, this is, as you know, Charlotte, this is a real topic I'm quite passionate about. It's not easy, particularly as organizations grow. But I think that one way to think about it is to think about culture. At least one way to think about it is to think about it through the analogy of personality. So your organization's culture, one way to think about it is it's what most people think, feel, and do most of the time. And if you think about it that way, the way that you sort of can shape culture, there's all sorts of ways. It's when you bring people in. I try to encourage people to stop talking about culture fit when we're recruiting and talk about culture add. So what person adding to the culture, as opposed to sort of like, will they fit in, and can we make them, fit into what we already have? And so what are they adding to the culture? And then of course, all these other levers you can pull on, like when you communicate a new policy, what's your stance on, remote working, which is a very relevant topic. The way that you communicate that to your people, how are they going to think, feel, and behave based upon those decisions? So that's just one way to think about shaping culture. Yeah. I'm sorry, Charlotte, I just want to go back and comment on something Asif said. And this, building on what he said around thinking about just this multicultural teams through the lens of, let's say, a passport, what their nationality is, and putting people in boxes. I mean, I couldn't agree with him more. I think that my experience in working across so many different countries is that, you can memorize and look at all of these do's and don'ts lists. This is the way people behave here, and this is the way they show up for work. I mean, I can tell you that I work for one of the biggest organizations in the world that happens to be German, and I met plenty of Germans that weren't punctual, despite the fact if you look at these lists, you see, oh, all Germans are always on time and everything's very structured. So I think it's better to look at people through kind of this think about their perspective, their experience, et cetera, rather than just labeling them with stereotypes based on their passport.
That's a great point. It sounds obvious, right? We want to avoid stereotypes and generalizations. At the same time, when you're inducing somebody or sending somebody to a new assignment in a new continent or a new country, you're giving them some form of a guideline, right? The do's and don'ts. And particularly I'm thinking of, whether you go Africa, Asia, or cultures that are totally different from yours, you'll kind of give them some form of guideline. That's helpful. At the same time, would you say that if I said, well, hierarchy, be mindful of hierarchy when working in Asia, because the way in which they see bosses is very different. If you adopt a coaching style, you might be seen as you not being authoritative or knowledgeable enough. Would you say that giving this type of guideline is then stereotyping? Is it helpful? Is it not?
I would say proceed with caution, assume nothing, and just be curious. The best help, for example, this is my second time in the Middle East. And my first time, I simply adopted a colleague from here that helped me, understand a lot of the local nuances. And I sort of used that person as kind of an onboarding buddy for the region, I guess you could say. But I think it's all about being curious, being genuinely curious and listening, as opposed to taking these sort of, stereotype lists too literally.
Yeah, I agree. Asif, you've also obviously have a huge remit internationally. You've worked for some of the biggest names in the UK and known internationally as well. In your experience, what have been some of the biggest challenges of working across cultures? And perhaps some of the biggest opportunities that kind of what you've learned over the course of your career so far? Asif, if you're speaking, you're on mute.
Sorry, I think I knew I was going to do that at least once. But the biggest challenges, I think, have been the point I mentioned around the perception that someone's not good or not doing a good job because they're not aligning to our way of thinking. And then rather than educating or working and finding a good working way or working way forward, the assumption is that the individual or group must adapt to us. However, on the piece of advantage, I think the biggest advantage or biggest way that we've benefited from global teams is cultural insights. You can't get better than cultural insights. I still remember we were, and I say cultural insights in every way, right? You can utilize your staff to gain new momentum in markets, or financial gain, to gain better ideas, more innovation, all the great things that diversity and inclusion do. We recently, well, when I was still at Adidas, we opened our store in Dubai, the big store. And it was interesting that we were trying to do the ad and marketing campaigns around that. And initially it was a team in the US that was looking at it and looking at it from a US perspective. But then we involved some of our local staff around, like, hey, can we use a camel in one of our marketing campaigns and put 3 stripes on a camel, or can we use the teapot and put 3 stripes and things like that? And we got some reassurance where there was, interestingly, hesitation from our US teams to appropriate culture that didn't belong to them and be seen as doing it in the wrong way. But we worked with our staff on the ground. We worked with the Dubai Chamber of Commerce and so on to try to really understand what can we do authentically. So if we are appropriating culture, we do it authentically, but benefits our organization. And it had huge benefits for us because we were then producing products or campaigns that truly captured and engaged with the local markets. Similar, I remember a couple of years back, and I'm only referencing the Middle East because this example in particular is linked to it, but BMW did a campaign, ad campaign during a couple of years back during Ramadan. And they based it on 2 brothers making up and coming together over that period of time. And it was one of their most successful campaigns because they utilized local knowledge, culture, understanding of something that was important from a religious perspective to run a campaign around it. Now, that campaign could have been different. And I've again seen big companies like, interestingly, I was speaking to some companies in Africa the other day around cars. And what they said was Range Rover hadn't in the past done a good job in Africa, because what they would do is they would pitch a Range Rover with a middle-class white family, flat cap in a farm in Middle England, and try to sell it to Africa. And people in Africa were like, we have our own identity, so we want to see what a Range Rover looks like to an African identity, not to this. So it benefits a business in a lot of ways, and we can embrace it and utilize. But to do that, you have to embrace your teams internally to really get those insights, to give them a voice, to give people, to let people challenge you and disrupt the patterns and the ways of thinking that we currently have.
Yeah, well, that links absolutely to the broader diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity agenda. I mean, I think the example Aisha just gave to us in Africa, and I think you saw my face, thinking, oh my God, what are these companies thinking? But it's true of any company trying to tap into any market. I mean, we know that Black Americans in the US are worth over $1 trillion in terms of market share. But how do you tap into the market if they're not represented in your leadership teams and you don't use those insights? Similarly with gender diversity and all types of diversity. So I think it's really, really important to remember who we are serving and try to serve them products that they want. Barry.
Sorry, I was just going to say on that point though, one of the interesting things as well is, just because I remembered something as you were speaking, was even when we're talking about communities, how they differ culturally by country to country is so important. So, with some of the importance of some of the campaigns in America with the Black community, really relevant. But if you're trying to target the Black community in Europe, the same campaign cannot work because the history, everything is completely different. And the same with the Black community in Africa. Yeah. So it's just understanding that piece. And goes back to our initial point that it's beyond the traditional sort of boxes that we've created and truly understanding the cultural differences.
Yeah, absolutely. So no, absolutely. And you're right. To me, that was obvious. It was obvious, but it perhaps isn't to everybody. So really making sure that you are also linked and integrated with the cultures, well, with the countries or regions or communities that you serve, be them wherever they may be. I'm quite interested, so we've talked about the advantage of getting cultural insights, and it's linked to productivity, innovation, and the bottom line, which is always the biggest argument for D&I, but one that I feel hasn't been heard enough yet. Recently, we've heard, I think overall diversity, inclusion, and belonging has gotten a lot of press thanks to recent movements, and perhaps a bigger attention, even though we're not there yet. Where do you start? And I'm thinking many organizations have just recently started this inclusion journey, which you've been on, both of you, for so many years. Where do you start when you are seeking to create an inclusive environment, whether for multicultural teams or just diverse teams in general? Are there any examples of initiatives or approaches that have worked for you for, let's say, fairly mature companies? And I know perhaps as if you were at the Telegraph before, but Barry, what would you say to that?
Well, I would say, sorry, there's a bit of background noise, Charlotte. This is the new way of working. I would say it really starts with, it's kind of a buzzword and has been for a number of years, but it starts with psychological safety. And what's interesting, and I think most everyone on the call will be familiar with this concept of creating an environment where everyone can show up as their true, authentic selves. And the interesting thing is that when you look at kind of the tenets around this, I mean, there's 4, 5, 6 things that leaders can do to really drive psychological safety, and it costs nothing. It actually costs nothing. It's not like it's some sort of big investment, or so I think that's the starting point. But of course, it's much easier said than done.
Then isn't everything? Sorry.
Yeah.
I thought that Asif was saying something, but no, I could.
No, I was just going to add, I mean, I couldn't agree with Barry more around the psychological safety piece and exploring difference. I think also for companies, one of the things we tend to do is predefine people's learning on diversity and inclusion, which is my new challenge to companies at the moment, right? So this predefined that we're going to teach you about inclusion, and here's the 10 things we do, and here's the 5 steps, and this is what it means to us. It means different things to different people. Let people explore, create the environments of psychological safety, create the environments of learning and development. Let people determine what that learning looks like, but let people discuss different things. The D&I police, and I call this, I say D&I police because we've predetermined everyone's learning. There was this over the years, and Barry can probably remember this, where we went around telling people what you can and can't say, what you should and shouldn't say, what terms to use and not use. Unique identities mean people are different. But we need to create an environment that people explore that, learn, self-taught learning, experiential learning, disagreeing. When was the last time we I mean, there's this misconception that for us to be truly inclusive, we must all embrace inclusion the same way. No, we can argue. I mean, me and Barry probably have different views on different things. That's fine. But if we were working towards a common objective, right, that's the big thing. How do we get to the end goal? Whether we take different paths, whether we see things slightly differently, that's fine. We'll respect each other. But there is, and especially now in the current world that we live in, and I hear this a lot, that you're no longer able to have one view, whatever that view might be, and you can't even sit on the fence, right, with anything. You have to take a strong view. It's either this side or that side. And I disagree. We should be able to really create a safe space where everyone can share views, of course, with respect. We're not saying that you should discriminate against anyone or say negative things, but we cannot go away from basic human, that's how we learn, human interactions, through engaging with each other.
I think some really, really important points here. So psychological safety, but also that comes through employee voice. That comes through the ability to have open communications and conflict. And we know that cultures, we do actually have a few reports from the CIPD on the topic and more coming up, but we know that teams that have a healthy approach to conflict and where conflict isn't avoided, because healthy conflict doesn't mean there is no conflict. I mean, we have those healthy disagreements, actually end up being more innovative, more agile, and fare better in crisis. Another thing that we've seen a lot in the past year, and as a result of the pandemic perhaps, is enhanced, we've talked a lot about and seen a lot of vulnerable leadership. We've talked a lot about the importance of empathy, whether when dealing with mental health, but also when just generally leading in uncertainty. How does empathy or empathetic leadership, first of all, how does it show up, and how does it, in your opinion, support positive outcomes in multicultural teams? What does good look like? If you could give us a couple of examples. I know that might be off the top of your head, but that would be really, really helpful. Barry, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. So I will. I'll maybe contextualize this around what's happened during the past, 15, 16 months. I mean, I was lucky. I've done a lot of remote working, et cetera, and being a part of and leading remote teams in the past. But, some people, this has been new for them. But I think what's happened over the last 15, 16 months is authenticity, the opportunity to leverage authenticity to really build connections with people, again, across cultures has been pretty extraordinary. I mean, I don't think I've ever experienced in my career so many meetings with executives in tracksuits and t-shirts. You meet people's pets, their partners, their kids. And as you all heard of my kids in the background earlier, this is kind of the new reality, but it's actually really refreshing. And my hope is that, we've now in many cases seen the much more full version of especially a lot of our senior executives. And my hope is that we retain that in some way, because it would feel quite strange if all of a sudden, as many organizations are thinking about when are we going to get back in the office and what does that look like, to all of a sudden then close that off when you've opened up your full self to people, particularly for our executives.
Yeah, absolutely. I know this is something that you and I, we've talked about offline, Barry, but it's really just having seen whether news anchors or executives in their homes with their cats, their dogs, their kids, their problems, their fears, some of them, isolating from the rest of the family with because of COVID, to just suddenly go back to wearing three-piece suits and not talking about anything but work, seems really, really unlikely. What do you think that return and future looks like for organizations? Is this something that you're thinking about in your organization? Are you seeing this time as an opportunity to rethink some of your culture?
For me, Charlotte, I'll say this, that I think it's, without even pushing, I think a lot of our most senior leaders, I can speak for my organization, I think they've had a real sort of breakthrough during the past 15, 16 months. They've had a real sort of breakthrough that, I've opened this up. I see a completely different side of my people. And I don't think they actually want to go back to the way things were before, for the most part.
Yeah, and I think just to sort of add to that, there's a few elements, I think, to this return to work. I think we will never go back to whatever normal was. It will be a hybrid working environment. I think one of the things we must learn from this period of time is that, and actually, Barry, the point you raised about insights, we've learned more about each other than ever before, because we've always taught that you come into the office and you put on this work face and just, that's it. You don't talk about anything beyond that. So we're doing a lot more of that now. However, I think it'd be crucial for us to understand, as we go back into this place of work, what is that flexibility that we build into this? Because I don't think it will be one size fits all for any group. There'll be some people who want to come back. I know of younger people who share accommodation with 4 others and they're struggling and they want to come back to the office. I know of others like myself who selfishly don't want to travel an hour into London, so I'd rather work from home and save that hour, and others with other needs and so on. But what we need to do is start looking at it from a very different perspective of that unique identity, rather than, okay, so let's go back to the boxes. So, okay, who are the women who have parenting responsibilities? Okay, you want to work flexibly. Okay, cool. So, but it shouldn't be like that. We should start just, if I want to run the marathon and I want to work flexibly because I'm running the marathon, so I want to take an hour out every morning to run and start a meeting later, that's fine. But also, the last point on that is, how do we not predetermine this? Because a lot of companies, and it's interesting, I've been watching companies, there's companies who are saying, we'll just work remotely forever. And I'm like, that will cause panic and anxiety for some. And then there's others, like certain big financial institutions, where like, oh, if you can go into a shop or a restaurant, you can come back into work. And I'm like, it's not the same thing. But what is the middle ground? But I think the middle ground shouldn't be predetermined. And that's the problem. We live in a society, and what last year has shown us is people don't like being told what to do. And especially from a UK context, you can see people rebelling now because they hate the fact that government's telling them where they can go, what they should, when they should wear a mask, when they shouldn't, what they get. People hate it. People want ownership of their decisions. But what are the boundaries? So if we as a company decide, hey, we can go up to 3 days flexibly, that's great. We shouldn't tell everyone, hey, everyone work 3 days flexibly. We should give the power to teams, line managers, to make that decision, knowing what the boundary is of how far we're going to go. But speak to your people, back to the human interaction. Ask your people, what would you like? What works for you? How do we ease you back in? Rather than, we've got 3 days, everyone, bang, do 3 days. I don't think that's going to work for each and every person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to other forms of flexibility. When we talk about flexibility in the past, we used to think that flexibility means being able to work from home. Now we knew that working from home wasn't flexible because it was the only thing we had to do. It wasn't a choice. And so flexibility is always about that never one size fits all. And that's something that we advocate very much. It's about those individual needs, wherever people are in the world, what their situation is at home, what they need, but also, of course, it has to be done in agreement with your line managers, about being able to have that flexibility. And I think that's one thing that I do a lot of webinars on this topic, and I can see the questions come in, and it's really tricky because the questions people want, we'd love to give you kind of a to-do list of like the do's and don'ts, but actually when we're talking about not a one size fits all, that flexible approach is really about being agile in the way in which you come up with these solutions and listening to your people, rather than having a checklist. Even though we have issued some fantastic checklists about how to return safely to the office, but when it comes to this, it's more shades of gray. What do you think, Barry?
Well, two things I'll say. I mean, Asif is very diplomatic because he did mention another CEO that made this ridiculous claim that people who don't want to come in are not engaged. And he got blasted, thank goodness, on social media for that claim. But I couldn't agree with Asif more. I think that the moment of truth that so many companies have about this now, about kind of ways of working going forward, is why don't we just ask people what they want? As Asif said, why don't we just ask them? But of course, that's a big moment of truth and requires a lot of courage, because if you ask them, then of course you need to sort of act on, voices heard, action taken. And that's where I think a lot of organizations they're not willing to do that, so therefore they don't ask.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to, again, having that two-way communication, keeping those channels open, keeping the opportunity to also shift things around as we try. And back to our topic as well, I think a lot of what we're saying right now applies to managing multicultural teams. Listen, ask what they need, ask what is working, what is not working, and try it out. There is so much more that we could say about this topic, but I'm just very mindful that we've got only 8 minutes left, and we do have a few questions that have come through. So the first one that I'll start with is Jennifer, who's asked us 2 questions. So the first one was about disability in particular, but I think it could apply to all types of diversity. And she was asking, when it comes to disabled employees, what can be done to avoid managers thinking only in terms of making adjustments to meet their practical or communication needs and move them into positively leveraging a difference? And just to link that to our topic, it's a bit similar to how can we avoid assuming that Muslims need to finish early, all Muslims need to finish early during Ramadan, and instead move to something a little bit more flexible. Asif, would you like to take that one?
Sure. And I think it's a really important point. So you look at visible, non-visible disabilities. I mean, even our current pandemic, long-term COVID, is it a disability or not a disability? And how are we going to treat that? What about, illness? We've got an aging society, especially in the UK. We've got an aging society. As people get older, they're more likely to develop a disability as they get older. How do we manage that? So there's all these bits. I think what is important is we don't choose for people. That's my bit. So how do we allow the autonomy of people feeling included? You don't have to, I was actually at an event this morning speaking there, and I was saying one of the frustrations for me is, again, when we create things, so we have, in the UK, we'll have disabled toilets, and then they're locked up and locked with a key. And the argument is that people will have access. Or if you don't have a physical disability and you walk towards this toilet, everyone looks at you. funny, like, ooh, they're just taking advantage. Why not just take all the toilets away and just make them all single sort of, accessible toilets for everyone? It's things like that that we need to definitely start to really address when it comes to disability. And the other big thing as well is, with this whole choice piece, I think it's going to be so important, even, and I'll end on this very point, but even with the mental health and the impact of mental health as we return back to work, it will affect people differently. There won't be one solution. You can't say, oh, anxiety, here's the treatment. It'll be different. Culturally, some communities talk about mental health, some don't. Some communities, will see it in a different way. All those things have to be talked about. We need to go back into the essence of what it means to people. And the reason this doesn't happen in organizations, and I know Barry sort of sided with me on this, that more conversations need to happen. It requires a bit more effort. The easiest response is you come to work and say, oh, I'm suffering with anxiety because of this return to work. Here's a number for our employee assistance program. Rather than as a manager having a conversation with you to find out what is your need. Same with accessibility, disability, conversations. That's what's missing, but it's more harder. It requires more effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that point, I think one thing we haven't talked about, but it's the two-way relationship, right? So you do want to meet the needs of or adapt to the cultural norms of the country in which you operate. At the same time, large multinationals also have an opportunity to sometimes push for progress and press for progress in countries that are not there yet. I know that we work with one of our members who's at WSP, a large engineering firm, and our friends at Hilton were telling us how, they went to countries in Africa, they were operating in countries in Africa where, let's say, maternity leave didn't exist, or in the Middle East where mental health is not recognized as an issue. Just a few years ago, we didn't talk even about having cancer, so let alone mental health. But as a large organization, it was their opportunity to, through the organization culture, start to push for change. And eventually, a lot of this often ends up in policy change as well. So I think that's an interesting nuance and important for people to remember. It's not just about compliance sometimes. Okay, one question on compliance. Somebody is asking us, how do you encourage compliance, such as report writing, and I assume we're talking about pay gaps, extra training, extra, which is necessary and legal according to our UK regulations within cultures that don't value these things in the same way and have other more informal ways of approaching these issues. Okay, so when you're in quite a regulated environment and you have to meet this, you have to be compliant. How do you encourage people to follow it when in their culture it's not something they normally do? Not sure if I understood your question, but if someone wants to, if either of you has, if you want to take it as if for Barry.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can field that one, Charlotte. I'll be honest.
No, but I think overall,
sure. Yeah, I was just going to say, Charlotte, that one of the things with any of these things, like the gender pay gap or other things, these are a good indicator and a good test in time to measure things, right? However, if we're talking about what the real essence of any of those things is, it's to drive change within an organization. So the people who might not understand the regulatory requirements around it, we shouldn't be running around for 2 weeks before the gender pay gap trying to complete it, because actually you're trying to then just complete it for the sake of doing. We should be working for the 12 months to address the gender pay gap within our organizations. And then it's not a compliance thing. You're doing it because it's the right thing to do. It goes beyond that you have to do it. The reporting is the bit that should be easy, but a lot of companies focus on that prior couple of weeks before you have to do something, or don't understand the Equality Act, disability, we must do something. No, it's the right thing to do, but the Equality Act keeps us in check to ensure that we're accountable for it.
Leading with ethics and doing the right thing. Last question on the impact of today's situation, which means that we have a lot less face-to-face time. We know it's impacted our mental health. It's changed the ways we've talked a lot today. You both have highlighted the importance of creating psychological safety and having open communications, but it's not as easy when you're in an environment where people are behind their screens and you can't see them. How would you mitigate the impact of having less face-to-face time on, especially when it comes to understanding and the lived experiences that have traditionally informed our multicultural teams?
For me, Charlotte, I would say kind of alludes to a little bit around some of the things I mentioned earlier. I think it's a lot of the things, connecting often with your teams, and also the leader kind of role modeling by not always just talking about work and business. I think, we all need this sort of time and space now to as a leader, taking some time to ensure that people are in a good place and what they need in terms of that should be part of the conversation every time. And also just these small things, like you obviously can't force people, but ideally you want to have people turn on their cameras, et cetera, because it makes it feel like more like you're having a real genuine conversation rather than an old school conference call.
It happens perhaps less spontaneously, but we need to be even, and which means we need to be even more intentional about cultivating.
You have to be more proactive than before. Absolutely.
About cultivating that inclusive environment, about ensuring we make space for these informal conversations and that we check in on people, which is what we've heard over and over again about the past year, but it's important to remember it. So moving forward, what do we do to keep this momentum going, this momentum of change? We've seen a lot of positive change in both of your worlds, even though it's been a difficult time for many. What do we keep? What do you think we did well when it comes to multiculturalism and leadership, and what would you like to keep? Asif?
Sure. I think one of the things, I think we all did some things good, some things bad. I think what's going to be really important maybe is when it comes to leadership, showing vulnerability, being authentic, as Barry mentioned, genuine is going to be big. It's very different because every Harvard, Cambridge, Oxford leadership program told you that leaders must have all the answers. Leaders must say all the right things. Leaders must have this, that, all false now. People want to see leaders who don't have answers, people who show vulnerability, people who are ready to engage. So I think that's one of the things we must learn, that having all the right answers is not going to help you because people will find gaps in that. You'd rather work with the people than tell them. So that would be the big change that needs to be driven. The other thing is, look, I mean, in the D&I space, I've been in this space long enough to know when no one cared about D&I, to when all of a sudden everyone wants to do something, some for the right reasons, some because it's the right thing to do, some because they want to look good, and some who don't want to risk losing their job without doing anything. So there's different reasons for the interest in it. But what is there is doors are open. And my view is that we somehow need to wedge our foot through those doors to ensure they don't shut back. I've seen them shutting back when we had Me Too. It went up, we did a lot of work, and then shut the door. And similarly, this door will shut again at some point. But how do we ensure that we create sustainable change, interventions that can continue, or we can continue to work on over the near future? I'd love to think, and I am an optimist, but I'd love to think that we'll continue this journey in a great way. But I do know the reality. Something will come, we'll get too busy, we'll start losing money, or we'll have a new thing that we need to focus on, and then people will forget. But how do we ensure that, especially those who can impact this, hopefully people on this call, that you create meaningful change and create those avenues to continue the discussion?
Consistency. Barry, any last words?
Yeah, no, I think well, two things. I couldn't agree with Asif more, is that I hope, and I already see this happening, that people will not quickly forget the lessons learned over the past 15 to 16 months about multicultural teams, about leadership, et cetera. And the second thing I would say is that those of us who work in some way with leadership development know that over the last 10 to 15 years that this whole sort of command and control, micromanagement style leadership was already in decline. And I jokingly say that I think COVID killed it. It's extinct. It has no place for the future. And going forward, it really is about being an authentic leader. And I think those organizations and leaders that really embrace that, I mean, that's the future.
Thank you so much, Barry and Asif. I hope everybody that this has been helpful. I know perhaps not as as concrete as some of you would like, but these are some of the topics where it's really important to have these open conversations. So yeah, we've highlighted the importance of agile leadership, hopefully the importance of keeping vulnerable and open in the future, fostering psychological safety, focusing on employee voice, and most of all, having open communications and creating those opportunities for teams to get together, to get to know each other, regardless of the type of diversity. Today, I was joined by Barry Lumpkins, VP Leadership and Talent Management at DP World, and Asif Sadiq, VP or SVP of Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging at Warner Media. Thank you everybody for joining us. If you have missed out part of the webinar, the recording will be available on YouTube, I believe, and on our social media channels. You can check us out at CIPD Middle East on LinkedIn or CIPD, just CIPD, and connect with our panelists if you have any further questions. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.